And this is one of kind of the justifying texts that people of faith will use to kind of disassociate with people outside of the faith and outside of the church. And it's a troubling text, not only for what it says, but also for when it says it. Because, like I said, it's a follow-up from our instructions last week, that instruction on reconciliation, that God has reconciled God with us, and so we are given this ministry of reconciliation between one another. He wrote, "Now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation. And we're putting no obstacle in anyone's way for receiving the gospel." Now, see, that's more reflective of that evangelistic zeal of Paul. He's the one who wrote, "I will be all things to all people, whatever it takes to win just one person to Christ. I'll give up my Jewish heritage. I'll give up my separatist ideas if I can just save one soul." And then we have, right in the middle of this message of reconciliation, a message of exclusivism. And it's so out of place. It's so out of place with Paul's basic theology and all of his other writings, but also with what he just said. And it's so troubling that scholars debate whether it was really Paul's writing or not, whether someone threw it in later, but we've never found any evidence of this section not being in there. So we have to say it is the word of Paul. And that word is, do not be yoked with unbelievers. Do not be matched with unbelievers, combined, allies, depending on your translation. Do not be yoked with unbelievers. So I guess the big question is, who is Paul defining as unbelievers? Now, the natural inclination is to just define that as the unsaved, as the lost, the non-Christians, those people outside the church. And if that's what Paul's saying, well then, how do we reach them if we're going to be separated from them? How are we going to share the gospel with them if we avoid them? What does he mean by being yoked? That's actually a quote from Deuteronomy that says, "Do not plow with an ox and an ass together." So don't plow with an oxen and an ass together. And the implication is work. So is Paul saying that as Christians we shouldn't work with non-Christians? Boy, that'll limit your career choices, won't it? Much less your evangelistic opportunities. But then elsewhere, Paul had written what we call the household codes, and y'all might not know those, but this is where he gave women their favorite wedding vows about wives submitting to their husbands. But there's more submission that Paul talks about. He also talks about slaves submitting to your masters. Obey your leaders and pray for your leaders and submit to them. So again, this doesn't go along with, if he's talking about working with non-Christians, so that doesn't go along with his other teachings. I've heard it applied to marriage. These devout Christians, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't be married to an unbeliever. Or if you're a Protestant, you shouldn't be married to a Catholic. Or, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't be married to a Jew or a Muslim. I've heard that applied in that manner. Marriage is work, so, it does kind of fit. But then Paul wrote, if any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband's made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife's made holy through her husband. For all you know, you might save your spouse just by being a Christian and a witness within that relationship. Now this writing kind of reflects the thoughts and the ideals and the evangelistic focus of Paul. So, what is Paul telling us? Who is Paul telling us to avoid? In what manner are we supposed to avoid them? He's very serious about it because he bolsters it with a very serious argument with the analogy of the temple of God for believers. Don't you realize you are the temple of God? You house the presence of God. Now, the temple was the center of faith and religion and society. And it allowed not only an access to God, but also a barrier to God, because the temple had differing degrees of accessibility. And you had the outer courts, which were the court of the Gentile, where anybody could come. And then you had the court of the women, where Jewish men and women could come. And then you had the inner court that only the Jewish men could come. And then you had the Holy of Holies that only the high priest once a year would go into. So there's different levels of separation and isolation. And so that's the argument Paul's given. Believers of the temple of God. Not just the temple complex itself, but the Holy of Holies, that inner sanctum, the house of the presence of God. And he reiterates the point. He says, come out from them. Be separate from them. Touch nothing unclean. And while this seems kind of out of place for Paul, it's right in line with Jewish thought. That's why the Pharisees and the Sadducees always got on to Jesus, because he hung out with sinners and he partied with publicans. He was always with those kind of people. And it seems like Paul's saying the same thing. That if you're going to be faithful to God, you've got to keep pure. And you've got to avoid the unclean. But I think understanding the original context of the phrase that Paul quotes can give us some understanding here. As I said, Deuteronomy says, do not plow with an ox and an ass together. An oxen and a donkey, two diverse beasts. Mixed beasts of burden. All they've been domesticated. We use them to plow. But you put them together and one's going to outwork the other. And you put them together and one will drag the other one down. So first of all, we do know he's talking about working together. Perhaps in line with what he wrote earlier about reconciliation. But he's talking about work, but not in a social setting. Not talking about working in a factory or in a bakery, but in the temple. Within the house of God. Within the church. So he's not talking about our relationships with the people outside the walls. He's talking about relationships with the people inside the walls. And while unbelievers is a term that Paul uses for the lost, he also applies it to the misguided people of faith, both Jews and Christians alike. And usually when Paul uses it for the unsaved, his tone is more generous and more compassionate. Like you might say to your unbelieving husband. But when he uses it more harshly, it's usually for those who should have known better. It's usually for the Jewish people who were persecuting Christians, or those teachers who came to the church after him and started opposing him and bringing in a different teaching and a different doctrine than he has, or for Arian Christians who need a little persuasion to get back on the right path. So unbelievers are used for those who were against Paul and his message, and those who did not live a life reflecting their faith, and those who did not have an attitude that reflected the gospel of Christ. So the lost are the ones that have no faith. The unbelievers here could be defined as people that have the wrong faith. Not the people who've never been introduced to the gospel, but those who have been introduced and have strayed, or not committed to the task. Not outside the church, but inside the church, the enemy in our midst. The ones we are plowing with. He talks about associating with Belial or Beliar, which is a proper name for Satan, and ties it to idol worshippers. And it's used for people who commit heinous crimes against the church and against God. So what he's telling us is that the true pagans, the true enemies of God, are not found in the secular temples, but sometimes inside the temple of God. Serious accusations. Serious accusations for his opponents, and a serious call to the church. And as many people say, this is one of the most misused texts of all of Paul's writing. People of faith have used it for centuries to justify separating themselves from the culture, separating themselves from the laws, or even separating themselves from other flavors of faith. But, as one scholar said, Paul envisions no separation between believers and unbelievers. Reaching out to the unbelievers was his mission in a social and civil context. Even in mixed marriages, he nowhere else talks about separating ourselves from the unsaved. He's not instructing us to separate from those we're trying to save, but from those who say they are saved and are not, so that we don't hinder our impact upon those who need to be saved. That's such a good quote, I think it needs repeating. Paul is not instructing us to separate from those we're trying to save, but to separate from those who say they are saved, so that we do not hinder our impact upon those who need to be saved. The reason the temple was separatist was to keep its contents pure and reserved and set aside and holy. And Paul is saying we need the same thing in the church sometimes. He's given that same instruction to us. You can't do the work of the church if the workers of the church are not equally committed to the task. If you're an ox for God, you can't be plowing with an ass. You just can't do it. If we're not equally reflecting a redeemed life and not equally committed to doing the work of God, we're not going to get that work done. And if we're not equally reflecting a redeemed life, we're going against the very message that we're trying to put out there. Because the most impactful message we have of the power of God through the gospel of Jesus Christ is that it brings change. It brings transformation. It not only saves, it redeems. That's why William Willimon entitled his book on the church, Resident Aliens. We're supposed to be in the world but not of it. We're supposed to be a group of people that are unique from the trappings of the society that we live in. People who reflect different goals and different motivations and different purposes. And an island of culture, as he describes it, that stands in contrast to our society. And the sad truth of the matter is, too often we are no different than the people outside of our walls. Sometimes we're even worse. As one person described it, we've got a weakened understanding of what it means to be the people of God today in the church. And one of our greatest challenges is to combat that cultural accommodation that is so prevalent in the church today. Because our freedom from the idolatries of our society are the greatest witness that we have to the world. By showing them something they are not. By showing them there's something that they can't find at Walmart. By showing them there's a different way to life. But sadly, in churches, we find that the cultural ideals of friendliness and fellowship are more prevalent than the difficult standards of faith. And we just reflect those, as one person describes them, the false unities of society. You know, we show more allegiance to citizenship and race and occupation and sports teams and political parties and social class and education than we do to Christianity. And that's why many describe the church as suffocatingly superficial. So superficial it takes your breath away.